Well, hello and greetings from Asia Society in New York City. I'm Christine Davies, Vice President for Global Partnerships and Development. It's a pleasure to participate from afar in the program that's been organized by the Asia Society Australia Centre and the National Gallery of Victoria, a trusted Asia Society partner in beautiful Melbourne, on the topic of philanthropy, and especially as philanthropy relates to the traditions in our two cities that have so much in common. One of these commonalities is fortunately having an Asia Society Centre, and we're so thrilled about the recent announcement by the Premier of Victoria to establish an Asia Society Centre in Melbourne, and we're delighted to welcome you all to the Asia Society family. Today's discussion is really timely, and it connects not only our two cities, their cultural institutions, the leaders and visionaries, but it also connects the question on what role philanthropy and the many forms and shapes that it takes plays in the world today and in the communities that it serves. I'm really pleased to be interviewing someone who carries one of the great torches of philanthropy in the world today, Charles Rockefeller. Welcome.
Thank you.
Would you please introduce yourself and your connection to Asia Society?
Certainly. And I can do that so with all the more feeling because we're both wearing green.
That's right. Not planned, by the way.
Right, yeah, exactly. It was meant to be. So my name is Charles Rockefeller, a trustee of the Asia Society, and my grandfather, John D. Rockefeller III, is the one who was the founder of the Asia Society, so it sort of runs quite literally through my veins. And my father, John D. Rockefeller IV, was a trustee up until recently, until he's sort of retired, and now he's an honorary life trustee. And so I'm very proud to carry the torch to represent the family in the John branch of the Rockefeller family, and especially to honor my grandfather to serve as a trustee.
Fantastic. Well, since you brought up your grandfather, could you talk briefly about the Rockefeller philanthropy story? How did it all start?
Sure. It's quite something. And I've been asked that before and wondered about it before, and it's hard to sort of put your finger on one particular thing. But if there was that one thing, it is that when John D. Sr. Was 14, he had a job as sort of an accountant's assistant, and he kept a careful ledger of all of his expenses. It's called the legendary Ledger A, which is in the Rockefeller Archive Center. But the earlier version of that was when he was still in his teens, and he was a meticulous recorder of expenses and income. And starting then, he gave 10% of his income to alleviate poverty in China, which was absolutely a very distant place at the time. And I don't know how the money actually got there, but he made sure that it did. And so it was in him from the very beginning, and I think that came from. I'll talk about his father a little bit later, but his mother, Eliza, was a very strict Baptist, and so that was part of the way that they were raised, was to give to the church. And so then he extended that into other things.
Fantastic.
Later in his life. Yeah.
It's too bad they didn't have blockchain back then to kind of track the flow of it. And then how did it evolve, Charles? I mean, so that's the root of the philanthropy, and then obviously it was able to escalate, I guess it's fair to say, over the years. How did the progression work?
Sure. Well once I would say that progression started to work once it needed to, and that sort of breaking point, or whatever you want to call it, is that was when Standard Oil reached a certain level of success, and he just had requests from all over the world for money, and even a couple of times or a number of times I've seen photographs of from a faraway place. It would just be a picture of his face that someone cut out of the newspaper, and then and then just sort of New York. And so, deliver to this man, yes, and asking for whatever, and that was not, I think he sort of started to go through some of those, or his staff, but it needed to sort of be, put into a system. So his advisor, Frederick Gates, helped him to convince him to say, you need to make this like a structure, and to sort of run philanthropy almost like it's a business.
To systematize it, yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And he said that if you don't deal with this now, the weight of your fortune will, burden the generations below you, and they won't have kind of a lesson to learn from. So it was quite literally the number of requests that he got, then it was decided they needed, and that was the beginning of the Rockefeller Foundation.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Did he keep all of those requests in a ledger as well? Do you have record of all of those? Or?
No, I think there were too many.
Gotcha. Too many that came in. So there's an interesting case study, really, that the Rockefeller story has given us, just about how successfully, those days planted the seed and established organizations, like Asia Society, the Museum of Modern Art here in New York City, and so many other institutions. Institutions that benefited from your family's philanthropy, but are now self-sufficient and sustainable long term. How do you think that came about, and what can we learn today from that model of giving, or that structure that your family, your great-grandfather in particular, and grandfather in particular, brought to bear in philanthropy?
Sure, I would say it was kind of a combination of their personal interests mixed with things that they thought needed to be done for a society. So actually the Museum of Modern Art came about because my great-grandmother, Abby Aldrich Rockefeller, the garden in the museum is named for her. She started to hear about and acquire these paintings from these guys called Monet and Picasso.
Those guys.
Cezanne. And then actually the very first iteration of the MoMA was actually back when there were sort of houses on Fifth Avenue. They lived in, amazingly, a 9-story house at on sort of the corner of 54th and 5th. My John D. Jr. actually didn't really care for modern art. He liked sort of traditional stuff, and he then he donated the Cloisters, which is a wing of the Metropolitan Museum, and that was more his style. But he thought, like, well, sure, we'll give this stuff a try. So the very first iteration of the MoMA was the top floor of their house, where he didn't really have to be too close to it. And then they eventually sort of gave that entire house, and then they owned more land on the block and sort of created the larger MoMA. And it was encouraged to him that there were 2 other founders that my great-grandmother worked with, but it was Abby and John that sort of did the most. And it was suggested and/or requested of them to call it the Rockefeller Museum of Modern Art.
Really?
Yeah. So, and they, that of course for most people would be an easy yes. Well, absolutely, I should get recognition for this. But they had the foresight to say, no, let's just call it the Museum of Modern Art. And the reason it was sort of clairvoyant was because they indicated that it would be difficult for the, and you were referring to the sustainability of institutions, difficult for the museum to raise money in the long term down the road if it had the name Rockefeller on it. So what, and 50 years later, like, why would I write a check to, something named Rockefeller? And I guess the other, other museums like the Guggenheim and the Whitney and whatnot, I think the MoMA has done better with fundraising precisely because of that. So
isn't that amazing? What a selfless act that really has manifested itself in that sustainability and self-sufficiency. That's amazing.
Exactly, and that proved to be the wiser choice long term. Yes.
Great. What is your family's approach to charitable work and giving today? How has it evolved since the days of the founding of MoMA and sort of that, period where the Rockefellers really were, your family really was defining philanthropy in the United States.
Right. So it's interesting. Obviously, the philanthropy that our generations, the succeeding generations, do is at a much smaller scale, but we still do it with the same lessons.
And you're still managing some great assets that were put in place back then.
Exactly. Yes. So the structure that we do that in, I should mention that there's an organization called the Rockefeller Philanthropy Advisors, which quite literally is a firm which has clients who are wealthy enough to actually need someone to help them give away their money. And they have sort of enormous database and experts on and advising people how they want to give. And I think there is an association with probably Rockefeller and Carnegie in terms of the founders of philanthropy. And I think people from around the world, you and I were discussing earlier before the interview about China, but I think in a lot of other places it's the Rockefeller sort of model is looked to as an example that has lasted. And the way that we make it last within the family is that 2 times per year we have sort of a larger family get-together, one in December, one in June, and so other family members are sort of on the other Rockefeller institutions. Like my sister is the chairman of the Rockefeller Brothers Fund, and another cousin is the head of the Rockefeller Family Fund, which are, so the order would be the Rockefeller Foundation, Brothers Fund, Family Fund in terms of assets, and there's some other smaller individual ones. But that's how we learn from each other, is that the trustees and chairman of those organizations give updates when we're gathered as a family, so that we can learn and be in the loop. And there's been a lot actually of sort of activism in the recent past with a couple of cousins of mine, standing up to Exxon, or rather, who can really stand up to Exxon, but about 15 years ago, there was an effort to separate the role of CEO and chairman, and then the Rockefeller Family Fund has made efforts to have Exxon sort of be more clear about evidence that it may have withheld about climate change, et cetera. And I think that message, it's more powerful coming from members of the Rockefeller family, because not a lot of people know this, but Exxon was sort of, Standard Oil was, when it was broken up in 1911 by the Sherman Antitrust Act, Exxon was one of the companies that started.
Part of the evolution.
And that's it, yeah.
Amazing.
So that's how we learn from each other, I would say, yeah.
So there's not a family app yet. You're really meeting at this meeting and exchanging things. Someday there'll be a website.
Exactly. And we do have a family office, actually, I think, which is relevant for those interested in, establishing legacies. The Rockefeller Family Office was the first one ever, to exist. And others have sort of modeled theirs after it, but that's another way that sort of keeps the family together.
And a coordination body of sorts for all the philanthropic activities.
Correct, yes.
That's great. So Charles, the Rockefeller name, is so synonymous with philanthropy, and its name is attributable to so many causes, both here in the United States and China, as you and I have both seen, and around the world. How do you identify the causes today that the family chooses to support? Or is it more that you feel like by overseeing the entities that you've established, Rockefeller Foundation, Rockefeller Brothers Fund, and the other organizations, you let them kind of choose the projects and the causes? Right.
No, that's a good question. I would say that the family members tend to let the foundation and the Brothers Fund and the Family Fund kind of continue with their own mission, and not try to sort of interfere with that, but get involved when they want to.
Yeah.
But in terms of family members who want to find sort of their own causes, so one of the sort of identifying factors that was in the bylaws of the Rockefeller Foundation was that it has to have a proven, or rather, it has to have enough data to show that it will very likely have a proven social impact, or for the betterment of humanity. And I think that is probably the lesson that we take forward with us in terms of, because it's so there's lots of charities, and I think that it's tempting to sort of write checks and but it is better to study them first and see what is the leadership, what is so if they're new, where have they gotten some of their kind of ideas from. And if they're just sort of recently begun, like what have they done so far to sort of to merit some money? And so actually, I mean, and for me personally, I have left my a fair amount of, in the case that I pass away suddenly, that a fair amount of my will to the United Negro College Fund.
Amazing.
And just the reason being that I think it's most important to kind of bolster those who maybe didn't have as much of a head start, and that was the same thinking behind it. My sister was on the board until recently of Spelman College, which is traditionally well, it started in the 1920s, I think, but traditionally. Women-only African-American college, which was extremely
great school,
clairvoyant. And so for me, also I give to an organization that does a particularly good job with mentoring students who show promise in high school but who are disadvantaged. And that just through the recommendation of a few friends of mine, I chose that one, and it's really meant a lot to me, because like some of the students I've worked with have excelled, tangibly because of the organization. So,
fantastic.
Yeah, so it's kind of what touches you personally as well.
Yeah, well, and it's amazing, and we both know the stories of, I think, your grandfather doing similar work with his causes, really wanting to meet the men and women and organizations that he was touching with his philanthropy. It makes me wonder what both he and your great-grandfather would think of the data that's available today to help track these investments.
Exactly.
and see what the impact is like.
And
which
that's
is great.
even done more specifically. You say the word impact. The concept of impact investing has I'm sure most people have heard of it, but it's sort of along with philanthropy. It's being looked at as kind of a new kind of philanthropy. So investing in companies that have a measurable positive social impact. And so that a few family members are involved with that.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Fantastic.
So that's continuing that evolution. Yeah.
Great. Do you feel there are certain expectations or pressures on you to continue this work? And I'd also be interested in sort of how you were educated about, kind of your family's history and legacy, and kind of instructed on your role in it as you were growing up.
Sure, yes. The quick answer to your first question is no, I don't feel pressure, which is a good thing. I feel honored to be a part of this family, and very lucky. And so I would say that my knowledge of some of the family's work in philanthropy started in my mid-20s, because my father was in politics when I was growing up, and we were in West Virginia and Washington, D.C., and his job as a U.S. Senator meant that we couldn't go to as many of the family meetings that were held here, and but I would say individually I learned through him about sort of the importance of kind of finding a passion and going with that. So I would sort of learned these lessons like naturally by osmosis over time.
Fantastic.
And we are, I'm on a couple different boards of the family created institutions. and I'm just happy to have the chance to learn. So there's no sense of pressure that I feel.
That's great.
And we're not taught to. No one tells us you need to, continue this tradition. It happens organically.
There's not like a driver's ed test you have to pass by
Right.
age 16 or
Yeah,
something
exactly.
on the
That's
family
it.
history.
That's it.
Great. You talked a bit about impact investing and the interest of yourself and your family members in that. How do you think philanthropy has been kind of businessatized or systematized over the years? It sounds like donors more and more are expecting quantifiable results and returns from their giving. Do you see that? Do you think that's a good thing, or?
I think it's a good thing, and I think that taken to the next level, that goes to impact investing,
Yeah.
where there's you can really look at the numbers and percentages. And I know less about impact investing, but I think that is part of the reason why the field of impact investing came about, because people wanted to start to see more tangible sort of results. And it's they invest, they can make money as well, but I think there's some people I think want to just kind of give for giving's sake, to think, as opposed to making a return on the investment.
Right.
But I think there's a nice balance between the two, which kind of covers both areas and creates success and across the field.
Fantastic. How important do you find private giving, philanthropy, to be in uncertain times? There's so much being written today that here we are kind of at a crossroads, if you will. The U.S. is seeing, so many philanthropic efforts facing challenges, I think both from the fact that there are so many organizations, in the field that are competing for dollars. We're also seeing, budget cuts in certain areas to programs that philanthropy is now coming in to fill the vacuum for, and that sort of thing. Is this kind of a call to action, for private giving? What are your thoughts on that?
I would say that I don't have a precise answer for you on that, but maybe I have an analogy which could speak to it. Because it's hard to put your finger. Yes, we're in uncertain times, and but it's hard to say, well, this is what I'm going to do about it, and it's going to make this difference. The one, just going back to John D. Jr. So when he built Rockefeller Center, it was at the very depths of the Great Depression.
Wow.
Yeah. So that, and in fact, half of his own fortune was eliminated by the stock market crash, but still he paid he paid entirely all, and in totality, sort of 17 buildings, not just the flagship one, but the other ones around it too. And sort of, I think historically, so he saw that as important. The plans had sort of been in the works, and then of course, like at that time, sort of plans are put on hold.
Sure.
But he said, no, we're going to do this, and he had the means to do it. But it was especially important to recognize his leadership, because when a country or a society wants to show a sign of confidence, it builds, right? That's the Burj Khalifa in Dubai or whatever. It's like you're making a statement, So
Right.
Not a lot of people have sort of heard this, but some economists have actually credited the construction of Rockefeller Center with helping to get the country out of the recession, the Great Depression rather.
Amazing.
And so the story of the Christmas tree, which is now sort of a legendary tree every year, but the first one was about 10 feet tall and some strings and a couple of ornaments on it and whatnot. But it was put up by the construction workers, and it was kind of like a thanks for the jobs,
Wow.
Mr. Rockefeller,
Wow.
and so, and looking back, I mean, that was incredibly selfless of him to keep going with that.
Amazing.
without any sort of government assistance or anything. But I would say that is kind of that's an exception, of course. But I think in terms of those thinking about the legacy that they might want to leave, or having sort of a quiet impact, that in uncertain times it's sort of especially important to keep giving, and I think that will be historically that will be kind of, or in the future, that will be looked back upon and appreciated
absolutely
much more, and quite frankly respected much more.
To really lean in those times of challenge and those times of need.
Exactly.
Absolutely.
Yep. Absolutely. That will sort of determine the great ones, right?
Yep. Absolutely. Charles, what is your sense of institutions like Asia Society? We've got cultural elements, policy elements, Pan-Asian, East-West, all of that. What role do institutions like Asia Society play today, and what do you hope to see an entity like Asia Society do in the future?
Sure, I would say the role that, we'll talk just about Asia Society, the role that it plays, I would say, is vital. And it is, you must have sort of nonpartisan organizations completely disconnected from the government that can think independently about these issues. And my grandfather, the first iteration of Asia Society was the Asia Society and Museum. He had a particular interest in Asian art and had the means to go and collect it. But he thought, after the war, that he saw great potential in Asia, and thought that Americans sort of needed to know about this, but knew that there was very sort of high tensions at the time, and a lot of Asia was kind of in poverty at the time. But he saw sort of what he found. He saw great promise. So he said, let's start with the art, and that will be sort of the initial, art is the one language that everyone speaks. So let's start with that, and let's have Americans appreciate some Asian art. And then it sort of course, expanded into economics and policy and what Asia Society is now. So I can't emphasize the importance and how proud I am to watch it. Sort of, I think our influence is even spreading now, and that's precisely because we're independent.
Yeah, I thank you for your leadership to make us that way.
A pleasure. I'll do what I can.
Good. Well, Charles, thank you so much.
Thank you, Christine.
This was great. We wish you all a wonderful rest of the day with your program in Melbourne. All the best from Asia Society here in New York City.
Thank you very much.